The first and only time I ever slept over at Jacob's house. His mum gave me 3 rules as she wished us good night. She was a kind woman with a nervous, bird-like energy, and she delivered the rules with a smile so strained it looked painful. Rule 1, she said, her voice a little too bright. Stay in Jacob's room after midnight. The old house makes noises, and we don't want you getting scared. Rule 2, if you hear a knock, you didn't, no matter what. She paused, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. And Rule 3, the most important one, if you absolutely must leave the room, you don't turn on any lights in the hallway. Not for any reason. I nodded, assuming she was just trying to build up the spooky atmosphere for our sleepover. Jacob, who was already setting up the video game console, didn't even look up. He'd heard these rules 1,000 times. The first few hours were a blur of pixelated starships and junk food. The kind of perfect, carefree night only 12-year-old boys can have. Jacob's room was in the attic, a converted space with slanted ceilings and a single large window that overlooked the dark, sleeping street. It was cozy, filled with posters and action figures. The house itself was old, a creaking Victorian relic, and I could understand why his mum would invent some spooky rules to explain away its groans. As the clock ticked past midnight, we finally shut off the console, our eyes blurry with fatigue, and rolled out our sleeping bags. I must have fallen asleep quickly, but I woke up a few hours later with a pressing need to use the bathroom. The room was bathed in the pale, silvery glow of the moon. Jacob was a still lump in his sleeping bag, breathing softly. I remembered the first rule, stay in the room. But I really had to go. I figured I could be quick and quiet. I slipped out of my sleeping bag, my bare feet cold on the old wooden floorboards, and tiptoed to the door. I paused, listening. The house was silent. Not just quiet, it was a deep, profound silence, as if the entire world were holding its breath. I opened the door with agonizing slowness and stepped into the pitch-black hallway, remembering Rule 3, no lights. The bathroom was at the far end of the hall. I navigated by memory and the faint moonlight filtering from Jacob's room, my arms outstretched. The floorboards were icy cold beneath my feet. Halfway down the hall, I heard it. A soft, gentle knock, dash knock, dash knock. It sounded like it came from the front door, downstairs. I froze. Rule 2. If you hear a knock, you didn't. My heart began to pound. It was probably just a branch tapping against the house. I told myself that over and over as I finished up in the bathroom and started the long, terrifying walk back to Jacob's room. I was almost there when I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it wasn't downstairs. It was closer. It sounded like it had come from inside the house, from one of the walls in the hallway. It was sharper, more insistent. I stopped dead, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. The silence that followed was heavier, more expectant. I could feel something in the darkness with me, a presence, a sense of being watched by something I couldn't see. I started moving again, my steps quickening, my breath held tight in my chest. I fumbled for the doorknob to Jacob's room, my hand shaking uncontrollably. just as my fingers closed around the cold brass. The third knock came. It wasn't on a wall. It wasn't downstairs. It was on the other side of the door I was about to open. The knocking. It was loud, hard, and final. I stumbled backward, a strangled cry catching in my throat. I stared at the bottom of the door. The sliver of moonlight from the room was suddenly blotted out, not by a shadow, but by an absence of light, a patch of pure, suffocating blackness that had moved to block the crack. It knew I was out here. It had followed me. I scrambled back from the door, my back hitting the opposite wall, and slid to the floor, my mind a whirlwind of terror. I sat there in the darkness for what felt like a lifetime, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. Eventually, the patch of blackness under the door receded, and the moonlight returned. I waited, listening, until the first birds of dawn began to sing. Only then did I dare to crawl back to the door, open it, and slip back into the room. Jacob was awake. He was sitting up in his sleeping bag, his face pale and slick with sweat in the grey morning light. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You heard it, didn't you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I just nodded, unable to speak. "You left the room," he said, a note of accusation in his voice. "You're not supposed to leave the room. Ever." "What was it, Jacob?" I finally managed to ask. He looked away from me, towards the closed door. "I don't know. It lives in the house. It walks the halls at night. It's always looking for a way in." He finally looked back at me, and his expression was one of dawning, absolute horror. It wasn't fear for me. It was fear of me. "The rules. They're not to keep you from getting scared," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're to keep it from finding a new room. It follows whoever is out there. It follows them back to their door." He pointed a shaking finger at the door to his room, the door I had just come through. "It knows this is my room, but now it knows it's your room too." And I understood the true, horrifying meaning of the rules. They weren't for my protection. They were for his. And by breaking them, I hadn't just endangered myself. I had painted a target on his door for a creature that now knew a new child was sleeping inside. The sleepover at my best friend Maya's house was a rite of passage. Her family had just moved into a sprawling, century-old house with a basement that was a perfect cocktail of fascinating and terrifying. It was a labyrinth of stone walls, dusty furniture covered in white sheets, and the damp, earthy smell of a place that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. That night, after her parents went to bed, Maya led me down the creaking wooden stairs, a flashlight in her hand. "I have to show you something," she'd whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. In the farthest, darkest corner of the basement, leaning against a damp stone wall, was a mirror. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, framed in heavy, ornate, tarnished silver. Its surface was cloudy and streaked with age, reflecting our flashlight beams in a murky, distorted way. "My mom says it came with the house," Maya explained. She wants to get rid of it. Says it gives her the creeps. Of course, we had to do it. The Bloody Mary legend was old news. We decided to invent our own. We would stand before the mirror in the dark and whisper our greatest fear 3 times. A dumb, childish game. Maya went first. Her greatest fear was spiders. She whispered it, her voice trembling slightly, then shined the flashlight on the mirror. Nothing. We both let out a nervous giggle. It was my turn. My greatest fear, something I had never admitted to anyone, was being replaced. The idea that someone could look just like me, live my life, and no one would know the difference. I stood before the mirror, the darkness of the basement pressing in, and whispered it. I'm afraid of being replaced. A beat of silence. I'm afraid of being replaced. My voice was barely a tremor. I'm afraid of being replaced. Maya clicked on the flashlight. My reflection stared back at me from the murky glass. It looked normal. Same messy brown hair. Same stupid grin I put on when I was nervous. But as I watched, my reflection's grin slowly, subtly faded. It was replaced by a look of profound, weary sadness. Its eyes, my eyes, seemed to darken, and for a split second I thought I saw a tear trace a path down its cheek. I blinked, and the image was gone. My reflection was just my reflection again, smiling its stupid, nervous smile. Did you see that? I gasped. Maya shook her head. See what? You just looked scared. Be quickly retreated upstairs. The game forgotten, but the image of my sad, weeping reflection was burned into my mind. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. I must have drifted off eventually, because I woke up hours later, needing a glass of water. I crept out of Maya's room and down to the kitchen. As I filled a glass from the tap, I glanced at the dark kitchen window. I saw my reflection in the glass, illuminated by the dim nightlight, and my heart stopped. My reflection wasn't copying me. It was standing perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, and it was smiling, a wide, knowing, triumphant smile. I dropped the glass. It shattered on the linoleum floor. I sprinted back to Maya's room, my mind screaming. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, refusing to look at any reflective surface. The next morning, I felt a strange sense of disconnect, like I was watching myself from a distance. As I brushed my teeth in the bathroom, I forced myself to look in the mirror. My reflection copied my movements perfectly. Everything was normal, but the feeling of wrongness wouldn't go away. I felt thinner, less substantial, like a fading photograph. When my mum picked me up, she frowned. You look exhausted, sweetie. Did you get any sleep? I just nodded, unable to explain the deep, gnawing dread that had taken root inside me. That night, in my own room, the true horror began. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in my closet mirror. It was just standing there, in the middle of the room, even though I was sitting on my bed. It turned its head and smiled that same wide, triumphant smile. I slammed the closet door shut, my breath catching in my throat. I spent the night covering every mirror, every window, every reflective surface in my room with blankets and towels. It didn't help. I started seeing it everywhere. In the reflection of a spoon as I ate breakfast, in a puddle on the street, in the dark screen of my phone. It was always there, in the periphery, a perfect copy of me, living its own separate life in the world of glass. And as the days went on, it grew bolder, more solid, while I felt myself becoming more transparent, more faded. My reflection looked more vibrant, more real. The final straw came a week after the sleepover. I was walking home from school, exhausted and paranoid. I stopped at a crosswalk waiting for the light to change. I glanced at the polished chrome bumper of the car stopped in front of me. I saw my reflection. It was standing beside me. It looked at me, its expression no longer smiling, but one of cool, detached assessment. It raised its hand and waved, not at me, but at the driver of the car across the street. Then it took a single, confident step off the curb and into the street. I felt a phantom force push me from behind. I stumbled forward into the path of an oncoming bus, its horn blaring. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. I opened my eyes. I was standing on the other side of the street, perfectly safe. The bus driver was screaming at an empty space in the road where I should have been. I looked back across the street, and I saw myself standing where I had been just a moment before. A look of faint, confused disappointment on my face. It was trapped on that side of the street. I looked down at my hands. They felt solid, real. The world around me was vibrant, colorful. The feeling of being faded was gone. I finally understood. The girl in the mirror wasn't a ghost. It was my reflection, my potential, my other self. And when I'd whispered my greatest fear, I had given it an invitation, an opportunity. It had been trying to switch places with me, to push me into its world of glass and take my place in the real one. And it had almost succeeded. Now, whenever I see a mirror, I don't look too closely. I don't linger, because I know she's still in there, my reflection, and she's waiting for another mirror, another whisper, another chance to step out of the glass and leave me trapped on the other side. The sleepover was supposed to be a celebration. My best friend, David, and I had just graduated from middle school, and his parents, as a gift, had let us have the entire weekend at their newly acquired, isolated lake house. It was a creaky A-frame cabin perched at the edge of a deep, dark lake, surrounded by 100 miles of whispering pine forest. It was perfect. The first day was a blur of swimming, bad horror movies, and enough pizza to feed an army. David was his usual self, loud, funny, and fearless. He was the kind of friend who made you feel brave just by being around him. The change began on the second night. It was subtle at first. We were telling ghost stories by the fireplace when David suddenly went quiet. He was staring into the flames, his expression blank, his eyes unfocused. I called his name a few times before he finally snapped out of it, a look of faint confusion on his face. "Sorry, man," he said, shaking his head. Just zoned out for a sec. Later that night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a rhythmic, scratching noise. I sat up and saw David standing by the wall, dragging his fingernails down the wooden planks, leaving long, shallow gouges. He was fast asleep, his eyes closed. I gently guided him back to his sleeping bag, my heart pounding, sleepwalking. It was creepy, but it wasn't monstrous. The next day, he was different. The loud, boisterous David was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful version I didn't recognize. He didn't want to swim or watch movies. He just wanted to sit on the porch and stare at the woods, his expression unreadable. When I tried to talk to him, his answers were short, his voice flat and monotone. The vibrant light in his eyes had been replaced by a dull, placid emptiness. He looked like David. He sounded, for the most part, like David, but he wasn't him. A cold, creeping dread began to settle over me. That night, I pretended to be asleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, my eyes barely slitted open, and I watched him. Around 2 a.m., he sat up, his movements stiff and jerky, like a marionette. He stood, walked to the front door, and slipped out into the night. I waited a few minutes, my terror warring with my concern for my friend, and then I followed him. I found him at the edge of the lake, standing ankle deep in the black, still water. He was perfectly motionless, his back to me, staring out across the lake. I was about to call his name when he began to change. It started with his skin. In the pale moonlight, I could see it shifting, becoming loose, ill-fitting. His shoulders hunched, his spine elongating with a series of soft, wet, cracking sounds. His limbs seemed to stretch, his fingers growing long and thin. He was molting. He was shedding his skin like a snake. I was paralyzed by a horror so profound it felt like it was rewriting my DNA. I watched as he, or the thing that was wearing him, slowly peeled the David skin from its body, letting it fall into the water like a discarded set of clothes. The creature that emerged was a nightmare. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its skin was the color of wet river clay, slick and glistening. It had no face, just a smooth, blank expanse of flesh where its features should have been. It stood there for a long moment, a faceless, naked horror, before it turned and waded deeper into the lake, disappearing beneath the black water without a ripple. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my mind a screaming, silent void. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to break, and I ran. I ran back to the cabin, locked the doors, and huddled in a corner, waiting. An hour later, David walked through the front door. He was smiling, his old, familiar grin back in place. He was holding 2 fishing poles. "Hey man, you'll never guess what I found down by the boathouse," he said, his voice full of its old energy and life. He looked perfectly normal, perfectly David, but his clothes were soaking wet, and clinging to the cuff of his jeans was a small, gray, translucent piece of what looked like shed skin. I stared at him, my heart hammering. I couldn't speak. He saw the look on my face, and his smile faltered. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice full of genuine concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." And that was the most terrifying part. I don't think he knew. I don't think he had any memory of what had happened. This wasn't a possession. It was a rental. The cabin, the lake. It was a place where something ancient and amphibious came ashore to borrow a human form for a night, to walk on the land, to feel the air. It would wear its host, explore for a few hours, and then return the skin to the shore, seemingly no worse for wear, wiping the memory of the event clean. David was just a vessel, a temporary ride for a faceless horror from the deep. We left that afternoon. David was himself again, laughing and joking, completely oblivious. But I couldn't look at him without seeing the thing that had worn his face. I couldn't shake the image of his skin, his identity falling away into the dark water. The sleepover was over, but the nightmare had just begun. I had gone to the lake house with my best friend, but the person I came home with felt like a stranger, a walking, talking shell that had been hollowed out and returned, leaving me to wonder what else lived in the deep, dark places of the world, and whose skin it would decide to borrow next. Sleepovers at my cousin Sarah's house were legendary. She lived in a cavernous, 3-story mansion that her parents had inherited. A place full of winding corridors, secret passages, and rooms that hadn't been opened in years. It was the perfect place to play games. But the one game we only ever played at her house, the one her parents had taught her, was a strange, ritualistic version of hide-and-seek. Sarah called it hiding from Mr. Fingers. The rules were bizarre and terrifyingly specific. The game could only be played after midnight. One person was the lookout. Their job was to stand at the top of the grand staircase with a single, unlit candle. Everyone else had to hide. The goal was simple: stay hidden until sunrise. But you weren't hiding from the lookout. You were hiding from Mr. Fingers. According to Sarah, he was a spirit that lived in the house. A tall man with very, very long fingers, who would collect anyone he found. If the lookout saw Mr. Fingers, they had to light the candle. The flame, Sarah explained, would pin him in place until the sun came up. But if he found you before the lookout saw him, he would take you. It was a terrifying, brilliant ghost story. And at 10 years old, we were all in that night. There were 4 of us. Me, Sarah, and our 2 friends, Liam and Chloe. Sarah, as the host, was the lookout. The rest of us scattered, our hearts pounding with a delicious, thrilling fear. Liam hid in an old linen closet. Chloe squeezed herself into a dusty dumbwaiter. I found the best spot of all, a small hidden space behind a false bookshelf in the library. It was a perfect hiding place. I could see the main hall through a small crack, but no one would ever find me. The clock struck midnight. The house fell silent. From my hiding spot, I could see Sarah at the top of the stairs, a motionless silhouette holding her unlit candle. The game had begun. The first hour was agonizingly boring. Nothing happened. My initial thrill faded into sleepiness. I was starting to think the game was just a dumb way to build suspense. Then I heard a floorboard creak downstairs. A long, slow, heavy creak that didn't sound like it was made by a child. I pressed my eye to the crack in the bookshelf. The grand hall below was empty, bathed in moonlight from the tall windows. But I felt a change in the air, a sudden, deep cold that had nothing to do with the night. From my vantage point, I could just see the door to the linen closet where Liam was hiding. I watched, my breath held tight in my chest as the doorknob began to slowly, silently turn. The door swung open. A shadow fell across the hallway, a shadow that was too long, too thin. A hand emerged from the darkness of the closet. It wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were grotesquely long, pale, and spindly, like the legs of a spider. They twitched, then slowly retracted back into the closet. A moment later, a soft, muffled sob echoed from within, and then it was cut short. The closet door swung shut. My mind refused to accept what I had seen. It was a trick of the light, my imagination. It had to be. I looked up at Sarah. She was still standing at the top of the stairs, motionless, her candle unlit. She hadn't seen it. A few minutes later, another sound, a soft, scraping noise from the wall behind me. The dumbwaiter, Chloe's hiding spot. I heard a faint, desperate whimper, followed by a sharp, tearing sound. Then silence. I was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. This wasn't a game. This was real. Mr. Fingers was real, and he had just taken 2 of my friends. I was next. I knew it. I huddled in the back of my hiding spot, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying he wouldn't find me. The library door creaked open. A figure stepped into the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, stooped over as if the ceiling were too low. It was dressed in a tattered black suit, and its hands hung down to its knees, its long pale fingers dragging softly against the floor. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, blank expanse of skin, like a mannequin. It began to search the room, its movements slow, deliberate, and silent. It ran its long, spidery fingers over the books, across the fireplace mantel, under the furniture. It was methodical. I watched, paralyzed with a terror so complete it felt like my heart had stopped. It was getting closer to the bookshelf. To me, it stopped right in front of my hiding place. It tilted its blank head, as if listening. I could hear my own ragged, panicked breaths. It knew I was here. It raised a long, pale hand, and gently, almost delicately, placed its fingertips on the bookshelf. This was it. It was going to find me. Suddenly, a flicker of light from the hallway. I risked a glance through the crack. Sarah, she had lit the candle. Its warm, golden flame cast a circle of light at the top of the stairs. I looked back at the figure in the library. It was frozen, its hand hovering inches from the bookshelf. It was pinned, just as Sarah had said. It slowly turned its blank, featureless face towards the light, and though it had no mouth, I felt a wave of pure, silent rage wash over me. I stayed hidden until the first rays of sun pierced the library windows. The figure was gone. I stumbled out of my hiding place and found Sarah, still at the top of the stairs. The candle burned down to a nub, her face pale and streaked with tears. We didn't speak, we just knew. We went to the linen closet. It was empty. The dumbwaiter was empty. Liam and Chloe were gone. When their parents came to pick them up, we told them they'd left early. We lied. What else could we do? No one would have believed us. The official story became that they ran away together. They were never found. Sarah's family moved out of the house a month later. I never found out what Mr. Fingers was. A ghost, a demon, or something else entirely. Something that was part of the house itself. I only know that he was real. And I know that the game was a ritual, a terrible annual offering. And that night, Sarah hadn't been a lookout. She had been a priestess, and her job wasn't just to protect the hiders. It was to make sure that Mr. Fingers got his collection, so he would leave her family alone for another year. The invitation to spend a week at Ashley's family's summer house was the highlight of my 16th summer. It was a beautiful, rustic cabin on the shore of Stillwater Lake, a body of water so remote and pristine that it felt like we were the only people on Earth. For the first 2 days, it was idyllic. We swam, we canoed, we told ghost stories around a crackling bonfire. It was on the 3rd night that the real ghost story began. We were the only ones there, a group of 4 girls, our sleeping bags laid out in the large, open-planned living room that faced the lake. I was woken around 3 a.m. by a sound. It was a low, melodic humming, coming from far out on the water. It was a beautiful, mournful sound, like a cello playing a single, sorrowful note. I sat up and looked out the large picture window. The lake was a sheet of black glass under a starless sky. I couldn't see anything. The sound continued for a few minutes, then slowly faded away. In the morning, I asked the others if they'd heard it. They hadn't. They laughed it off, telling me I'd probably been dreaming. The next night, I woke up again. The humming was back, but this time, it was closer. It sounded like it was coming from the middle of the lake, not the far shore. And it wasn't just one note anymore. It was a harmony, a low, sad chord that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was still beautiful, but now there was an undercurrent of something else. A deep, profound loneliness that was almost hypnotic. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening, a strange sense of melancholy washing over me. I felt an inexplicable urge to go outside, to walk to the shore, to get closer to the sad, beautiful music. I had to physically grip the sides of my sleeping bag to stop myself from getting up. By the 5th day, the dread was a constant companion. The lake no longer looked beautiful to me. It looked dark, deep, and hungry. The water was unnaturally still, the silence around it profound. That night, I didn't even fall asleep. I just lay there, waiting, and right on schedule, the humming began. It was at the edge of the lake now, right by the rickety wooden dock. It was a full-blown melody, a complex and heartbreakingly beautiful song of pure, crushing despair. It was the saddest sound I had ever heard, and it called to a part of my soul I didn't know existed. The urge to go to it was overwhelming. I looked over at my friends. They were all fast asleep. All except Ashley. She was sitting up in her sleeping bag, her back to me, staring out the window at the lake. She was being called to Ashley, I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't turn around. Isn't it beautiful? She murmured, her voice dreamy, distant. It's so lonely. It just wants some company. What is it? I asked, my blood turning to ice. My great-grandmother called it the Stillwater Singer, she said, her voice still a soft, hypnotic monotone. She said it's the lake, the spirit of the lake. It gets lonely in the summer when the house is empty, so it sings. It sings to invite people in. A horrible understanding began to dawn on me. Invite them in for what? Ashley finally turned to look at me. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her face pale in the faint light. To stay, she said simply, to keep it company, so it won't be so lonely anymore. My grotaunt heard it sing when she was a girl. She went for a swim one night and never came back. They said she drowned. The beautiful, sad music from the lake suddenly sounded predatory, its melody a silken, venomous trap. It wasn't just a sound, it was a lure. Ashley stood up, her movements slow and graceful, and began walking towards the door. Ashley, no. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and grabbed her arm. Her skin was cold, clammy. She was surprisingly strong, and she didn't seem to even notice me. She just kept walking, pulling me with her, her eyes fixed on the door, on the lake beyond. We have to go, she whispered. It's waiting. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound that finally woke our other two friends. They saw me struggling with Ashley, saw the blank, trance-like expression on her face, and they helped me pull her back from the door. The moment we dragged her away from the window, the spell seemed to break. She collapsed, sobbing, not knowing why she had been trying to go outside. And as we huddled together in the center of the room, far from the windows, the music from the lake changed. The beautiful, sad melody twisted, distorting into a sound of furious, frustrated rage, a discordant shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Then it fell silent. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, waiting for the sun to rise, listening to the profound, hateful silence from the lake. We left the moment it was light, leaving half our things behind. I never went back to Stillwater Lake. I know now that some places are lonely for a reason. They are imbued with a hunger, a predatory solitude that seeks to cure itself by consumption. The Stillwater Singer wasn't just a local legend. It was a siren. Its song a beautiful, deadly invitation. And I know, with chilling certainty, that it's still out there under the black, still water, waiting for the next summer, the next empty house, the next group of girls. And it will sing its sad, lonely song until its shores are no longer empty.